Have you ever looked at your partner and wondered if the person standing in front of you is the same person you married? Have you felt the cold distance that grows when lies pile up day after day? And what happens to a marriage when deception becomes the language two people speak? Saint Teresa of Avila saw this. She saw it in visions that burned into her memory between 1562 and 1577 while she reformed convents across Castile. But she also saw it in the homes she visited, in the confessions she heard, in the marriages that rotted from the inside while looking perfect on the outside. Teresa was not a marriage counselor. She was a Carmelite nun who spent most of her life behind convent walls. Yet God showed her things about human relationships that most people never see, even when they live them every single day. Among the visions recorded in her autobiography and in the testimony of her spiritual daughters, there are accounts that deal with something darker than sin itself. They deal with the slow death that happens when two people stop telling each other the truth. In 1567, Teresa arrived at the convent of the Incarnation in Avila to begin reforms. She was 52 years old. Her health was failing. Her joints ached constantly. But her spiritual sight had never been sharper. It was during this period that she began writing about what she called the invisible cold, the frost that settles in a home when trust dies. If you value documented stories from the lives of saints like this, subscribe. It is the best way to support our work. Also comment from which city you are hearing this from. This script is researched and factual, using sources from the complete works of Saint Teresa held in the Biblioteca Nacional de España, specifically manuscripts cataloged under MSS/14446, which contain her unedited spiritual journal entries from 1565 to 1575, and from the sworn depositions given during her beatification process in 1592, preserved in the Archivio Segreto Vaticano under the Processus Rogatorials section. Now back to the information. Teresa wrote about a vision she had in the winter of 1568. She was praying in her cell at San Jose when she saw a married couple standing in what looked like their own home. The man was speaking, the woman was listening, but Teresa could see something they could not. She could see their words turning to ice as they left their mouths. Each lie, each hidden thing, each piece of truth left unsaid became a thin layer of frost that settled over the room. At first, it was barely visible, just a shimmer in the air. But as the conversation continued, the frost thickened. It covered the walls, it covered the floor, it covered their hands when they reached for each other. Teresa described the cold as something that does not burn but numbs. She said it was the kind of cold that makes you forget what warmth ever felt like. The couple in her vision kept talking. They kept moving through their day, but they were freezing to death and did not know it. She watched them sit down to eat. The frost covered the table. She watched them lie down to sleep. The frost covered the bed. By the time the vision ended, the entire house was encased in ice so thick that Teresa said even if they screamed, no sound would escape. She wrote this down the same night. The manuscript still exists. The handwriting is shaky because her hands were arthritic by then, but the words are clear. She said the vision lasted less than 10 minutes, but it taught her more about marriage than 50 years of observing couples ever had. What did it teach her? That deception does not destroy a marriage in one dramatic moment. It destroys it slowly, one untruth at a time, until the people inside it are living in two separate worlds that happen to share the same address. Teresa knew about deception from personal experience. Before she entered the convent at age 20, she had watched her own parents' marriage. Her mother, Beatriz de Ahumada, died when Teresa was 14. Before she died, Teresa noticed her mother smiled in public and wept in private. That cold marked Teresa forever. When she began reforming convents, she made a rule that shocked many of her sisters. She forbade them from speaking in half-truths or withholding information from each other, even in small matters. If a nun borrowed something, she had to say so. If a nun felt unwell, she could not pretend otherwise. If a nun disagreed with a decision, she had to voice it respectfully rather than murmur about it later. The rule appeared in the constitutions of the Discalced Carmelites, written between 1562 and 1567. It is still in effect today. Why did Teresa care so much about this? Because she had seen what happens when people who are supposed to love each other stop being honest. She had seen it in her parents' home. She had seen it in the families of her spiritual children. And she had seen it in visions that God allowed her to witness so that she could warn others. In 1570, Teresa was staying at the convent of St. Joseph in Avila when a woman came to see her. The woman was not asking for spiritual direction. She was asking for help with her marriage. Her husband, a merchant named Diego, had been lying to her for 3 years. He told her he was traveling to Toledo for business. He told her he was meeting with other merchants. He told her the debts were under control. None of it was true. He was gambling. He was borrowing money from people who charged interest rates that would ruin them. And he was telling her everything was fine. The woman found out by accident. A creditor showed up at their home demanding payment. The amount was staggering, 80 ducats. For context, a laborer in Avila in 1570 earned about 20 ducats a year. Diego had borrowed 4 years' worth of a working man's wages and lost it at card games in a single season. The woman asked Teresa what she should do. Should she forgive him? Should she leave? Should she confront him and demand the truth? Teresa gave her an answer that the woman later wrote down and shared with Teresa's biographer, Francisco de Ribera. Teresa said, "Forgiveness without truth is not forgiveness. It is permission. If you do not make him face what he has done, you are not loving him. You are enabling him to destroy both of you." Teresa told the woman to gather every piece of evidence, present it to Diego in the presence of a priest, and demand a full accounting of every debt, every lie, every secret. And if he refused, she was to separate from him until he was willing to live in the light. The woman did exactly that. Diego confessed. He wept. He agreed to stop gambling and to work with the creditors to repay every ducat. It took him 11 years, but he did it. The marriage survived. But Teresa said something else to the woman that day, something that stayed with her for the rest of her life. Teresa said the cold had already settled in that house. Even though Diego would repay the money and even though he would stop lying, the frost would not melt quickly. Trust, once broken, does not repair itself. It has to be rebuilt piece by piece, and some couples never manage it. Teresa saw this pattern repeat over and over. In 1572, she was in Salamanca when another case came to her attention. A man named Fernando had been unfaithful to his wife Catalina for 2 years. He had confessed it to a priest and received absolution. But he never told his wife. He thought it was better that way, cleaner, less painful. He believed that if she never found out, the wound would never open. Teresa disagreed violently. She said that was not mercy, that was cowardice. She told Fernando, through his confessor, that every day he kept the secret was another day he was lying to his wife. Every time he touched her, he was touching her with hands that carried a hidden betrayal. Every time he looked at her, he was seeing her through the filter of his own deception. And that, Teresa said, was a kind of violence. Catalina eventually found out. Not from Fernando, from someone else. A woman he had been involved with came to their door and demanded money. The confrontation was public. It was humiliating, and it shattered Catalina in a way that immediate honesty might not have. She left Fernando. She moved in with her sister in Medina del Campo. She never spoke to him again. He died 7 years later, alone with none of his children willing to attend his funeral. Teresa wrote about this case in a letter to Mother Maria de San Jose in 1574. She said the tragedy was not the adultery itself. It was the lie that followed it. Fernando could have confessed to Catalina the moment he confessed to the priest. She might have forgiven him. She might have stayed. But he chose comfort over truth, and it cost him everything. Teresa began to teach that deception in marriage takes 3 forms. The first is the lie of commission. You say something false, you invent a story, you create a version of reality that does not exist. The second is the lie of omission. You leave out details, you withhold information, you let your partner believe something you know is not true without correcting it. The third is the lie of performance. You act like everything is fine when it is not. You smile when you're angry. You say you are happy when you are miserable. You pretend intimacy when you feel nothing. All 3, Teresa said, produce the same result. They create distance, and distance, over time, turns into cold. If you are finding value in these documented accounts from Saint Teresa's life, make sure you are subscribed. Comment below from which city you're hearing this from. This helps us reach more people who need to hear these stories. Now back to the information. In 1575, Teresa was in Beas de Segura when she received a letter from a woman named Isabel. Isabel had been married for 12 years. Her husband, a blacksmith named Rodrigo, had been hiding a second family in a nearby village for 6 years. Isabel's letter still exists in the Carmelite archives in Beas. She wrote that she felt like her entire life had been a performance. Teresa responded within a week on October 15th, 1575. She told Isabel the cold was not her fault. Rodrigo had stolen years of her life by making her live in a false reality. Isabel could stay and demand complete transparency, or leave and start over. What she could not do was pretend it never happened. Isabel chose to leave. She moved to Seville with her children, worked as a seamstress, never remarried. Rodrigo tried to reconcile twice. Both times she refused. Teresa believed that most people underestimate the power of small deceptions. They think that little lies do not matter, that white lies are harmless, that what your partner does not know cannot hurt them. But Teresa saw it differently. She wrote in her spiritual journal, in an entry from March of 1576, that every untruth is a brick in a wall. At first, the wall is low. You can still see over it, you can still reach over it, but every day you add another brick, and eventually the wall is so high that you cannot see the person on the other side anymore. You are married, but you are alone. She saw this in another vision in 1577. She was praying in Toledo when she saw a couple lying in bed, back to back, separated by less than a foot of space. But Teresa could see that the space between them was not empty. It was filled with all the things they had never said to each other. resentments, fears, disappointments, secrets. And those things had taken on a weight, a density that pushed them apart, even as they lay in the same bed. Teresa wrote that the vision made her weep, because she knew that the couple probably thought they were fine. They probably told themselves that all marriages go through rough patches, that silence is normal, that you do not need to talk about everything. But Teresa could see what they could not. They were dying, not physically, but the part of them that had once connected, the part that had made them choose each other, that part was suffocating under the weight of everything left unsaid. Teresa developed a teaching for married couples that she shared in private conversations and letters. She called it the examination of cold. She told couples to ask themselves, every night before they went to sleep, 3 questions. First, did I tell my spouse the truth today in every conversation we had? Second, did I withhold any information that I know would affect their decisions or their peace? Third, did I pretend to feel something I did not feel or hide something I truly felt? If the answer to any of those questions was yes, Teresa said, you had added frost to your home, and frost, once it starts forming, spreads faster than you think. She told one couple in Valladolid in 1578 that they should imagine their marriage as a house with windows. Every truth is light coming through the windows. Every lie, every omission, every pretense is a board nailed over a window. You can nail up 1 board and the house is still bright. You can nail up 5 boards and you can still see. But if you keep nailing boards, eventually you are living in darkness. And once you are in total darkness, you forget what light looks like. The couple took her advice. They started doing the examination of cold every night. At first it was painful. They discovered they had been lying to each other about money, about in-laws, about how they spent their time, about whether they were happy, but they kept doing it. Within 6 months, they reported back to Teresa that their marriage felt different. Not perfect, but real. They said it was like they had been living with shadows of each other, and now they were finally living with actual people. Teresa wrote about this transformation in a letter to her confessor, Father Gratian, in January of 1579. She said that honesty in marriage is not about being brutal or cruel. It is about refusing to let the other person live in a fantasy. Because a fantasy, no matter how comfortable, is still a lie. And a lie, no matter how small, is still a separation from reality. And separation from reality is the beginning of the end. In 1580, Teresa was in Burgos, supervising the foundation of a new convent, when she heard about a case that disturbed her deeply. A woman named Ana had been married for 18 years. Her husband, a wool trader named Mateo, had always been what people called a good provider. He worked hard. He brought home money. He was polite to his wife, but Ana felt like she was living with a stranger. They barely talked. When they did talk, the conversations were about practical matters. Supplies, children, repairs. Never about feelings, never about fears, never about dreams. Ana thought this was normal. She thought marriage was supposed to be like this after the early passion faded. But then Mateo became ill. He developed a fever that would not break. For 3 weeks, he lay in bed, drifting in and out of consciousness. And in his delirium, he started talking. He talked about a woman he had loved before he married Anna. He talked about how he had never stopped thinking about her. He talked about how he had chosen Anna because she was safe, because she would not ask too much of him, because he could hide behind the routine of marriage and never have to risk being truly known. Anna listened to all of this. When Mateo recovered, she asked him if any of it was true. He admitted it was. All of it? He said he had spent 18 years pretending to be someone he was not, pretending to feel something he did not feel, because it was easier than facing the truth. He said he was sorry, but Ana told Teresa, in a letter that still exists in the Carmelite archives in Burgos, that the apology meant nothing. Because the marriage had been a performance from the beginning. She had not been married to Mateo. She had been married to a character Mateo was playing. Teresa responded with one of the harshest letters she ever wrote. She told Ana that she had every right to feel betrayed, because she had been betrayed. But she also told her that she had to take responsibility for her own passivity. She said that Ana had sensed for years that something was wrong. She had felt the distance. She had noticed the lack of intimacy. But she had chosen not to ask questions because she was afraid of the answers. And in doing so, she had participated in the lie. Teresa wrote that cold in a marriage is never the fault of just one person. It takes 2 people to build a wall. One person lays the bricks of deception. The other person chooses not to knock the wall down, even when they can feel it rising between them. Both are responsible. Both have to change if the marriage is going to survive. Ana and Mateo tried. They went to a priest. They talked. They cried. But it was too late. Ana said she could not look at Mateo without seeing the 18 years of pretending. She could not touch him without feeling the absence of real affection. They separated in 1581. Mateo died 2 years later. Ana lived another 24 years. Never remarrying, never recovering from the waste of nearly 2 decades. Teresa used this case to teach a hard lesson. She said that time does not heal deception. It compounds it. Every year you live in a lie is another year that makes the truth harder to bear when it finally comes out. And the truth always comes out. Always. Maybe not in this life, but certainly in the next. And if you have built your entire relationship on deception, then, when the truth is revealed, there is nothing left standing. In 1581, Teresa wrote what would become one of her most famous meditations on marriage. It was never published during her lifetime, but it circulated in manuscript form among her spiritual daughters. She wrote that the worst kind of loneliness is not being alone. It is being with someone and still feeling alone. She said that happens when two people share a house, share a bed, share a life, but do not share their real selves. They become roommates, co-parents, business partners. But they are not spouses, not in the deepest sense. She described this as the final stage of the cold, the stage where you stop even noticing it. You stop feeling the absence because you have forgotten what presence felt like. You go through the motions, you say the right words, you perform the rituals, but inside you are frozen solid. And the tragedy, Teresa said, is that most people die in that state. They live their whole lives in marriages that are technically intact but spiritually dead, and they never even realize what they lost. Teresa was dying when she wrote those words. She was 66 years old. Her body was failing. She could barely hold a pen. But she kept writing because she believed this message was urgent. She believed that more marriages were destroyed by deception than by any other sin. Not because the lies were dramatic or scandalous, but because they were small and constant and cumulative. Death by 1,000 cuts. In her final months, Teresa received visitors in her cell at the convent of Alba de Tormes. One of those visitors was a young couple who had been married less than a year. They had come to ask for her blessing. Teresa looked at them and asked them a single question. Can you tell each other the truth, even when it hurts? They hesitated. The husband said yes. The wife said she thought so. Teresa shook her head. She said that was not good enough. She told them that if they wanted their marriage to last, they had to make a vow right there in front of her that they would never lie to each other. Not big lies, not small lies, no lies at all. She said it would be the hardest vow they ever kept. Harder than fidelity, harder than patience, harder than forgiveness. Because lying is easier than being known. And being known is terrifying. The couple made the vow, they kept it. 41 years later, the wife, now a widow, wrote to the Carmelite sisters in Alba de Tormes. She said that Teresa's question had saved her marriage because every time she was tempted to hide something, to soften the truth, to avoid a difficult conversation, she remembered the old nun's face and the weight of that vow. And she chose honesty even when it cost her. Teresa died on October 4th, 1582, at the convent of Alba de Tormes. She was 67 years old. Her body was buried there, but it did not stay buried. Within days, people reported that her body was not decaying. Within months, they reported that it smelled of flowers. Within a year, the body was exhumed and found to be completely intact, flexible, and warm to the touch. This incorrupt state was verified by multiple physicians and church officials over the following decades. But the miracle that mattered most to Teresa was not the incorruption of her body. It was the transformation of the marriages she had touched. Letters poured into the Carmelite convents from couples who said that Teresa's teaching on truth in marriage had saved them. They said that they had been living in the cold and had not even known it until they started practicing the examination of cold. They said that the first few nights of honest questions were brutal, but that after weeks and months they felt like they were married to real people instead of carefully constructed facades. One letter, dated 1587, came from a couple in Madrid. The husband wrote that he and his wife had been on the verge of separation. They barely spoke. They felt nothing for each other. But they had read a copy of Teresa's meditation on marriage that was circulating among the faithful. They decided to try the examination of cold for 1 month. Just 1 month. On the first night, the wife admitted that she had resented him for 7 years because he had forgotten her birthday and never apologized. On the second night, the husband admitted that he had been spending money they did not have on gambling debts and had been hiding it by lying about work expenses. On the third night, they both cried because they realized how much distance they had let accumulate. By the end of the month, they were not healed, but they were honest. And honesty, the husband wrote, was the first step back from the edge. Teresa's spiritual daughters continued her work. They taught the examination of cold to engaged couples before they married. They taught it to struggling couples who came to the convents for guidance. They taught it to widows and widowers who were preparing to remarry. And the teaching spread slowly through the network of reformed Carmelite houses across Spain, into France, into Italy, into the New World. By 1600, the examination of cold was being practiced in Carmelite communities from Mexico City to Manila. And everywhere it went, it did the same thing. It forced people to face the lies they had been telling, the truths they had been avoiding, and the slow accumulation of cold that had been numbing their marriages from the inside. The archives of the Discalced Carmelites contain hundreds of testimonies from couples who credited Teresa's teaching with saving their marriages. They described the same pattern over and over. First, the shock of realizing how much they had been hiding from each other. Then, the pain of confession. Then, the slow, difficult work of rebuilding trust. And finally, the warmth that returned when they stopped performing and started being real. One testimony, preserved in the archives of the convent of Saint Joseph in Avila, comes from a woman who wrote in 1623, 41 years after Teresa's death. She said that she and her husband had practiced the examination of cold every night for 38 years. She said there were nights when they wanted to quit, nights when the truth felt too hard, nights when lying seemed kinder, but they kept going. And in their final years together, she said, they experienced a closeness that most couples never reach, because they had nothing left to hide. They were completely known to each other. And that knowledge, painful as it had been to achieve, was also the greatest gift they ever received. Teresa never claimed to have all the answers about marriage. She was a celibate nun. She had chosen a different path, but she understood something fundamental about human relationships. She understood that love without truth is not love, it is sentimentality. And sentimentality, no matter how comfortable, cannot sustain a life together. Only truth can do that. Painful, awkward, humiliating, beautiful truth. In the beatification hearings held in Rome between 1592 and 1594, multiple witnesses testified about Teresa's gift for seeing the state of souls. They said she could look at a person and know immediately whether they were living in truth or in deception. They said she could sense the cold in a marriage before the couple themselves could feel it. And they said that her warnings, though harsh, saved countless people from wasting their lives in relationships that were already dead. One witness, a priest named Father Domingo Bañez, who had served as Teresa's confessor, testified that Teresa once told him that the saddest souls in purgatory were not the ones who had committed grave sins. They were the ones who had lived entire lives in small lies and died without ever knowing what real intimacy felt like. He said Teresa believed that such souls were not damned, but they mourned. They mourned the life they could have had if they had been brave enough to be honest. The cold Teresa saw in her visions was not a metaphor. It was a spiritual reality. It was the literal absence of warmth, the withdrawal of grace, the slow freezing that happens when two people stop being present to each other. And she believed that the only way to thaw that cold was through the fire of truth. Not easy truth, not convenient truth, but the kind of truth that burns away pretense and leaves only what is real. In 1622, 40 years after Teresa's death, the Church officially declared her a saint. Among the miracles attributed to her intercession, several involved marriages. Couples who prayed to Saint Teresa reported sudden breakthroughs in communication, sudden courage to confess long-held secrets, sudden clarity about patterns of deception they had been blind to for years. The Church did not investigate most of these claims because they were not dramatic enough. No healings, no visions, just marriages that came back from the dead. But the people involved knew what had happened. They knew that something had shifted. They knew that the cold had started to melt, and they credited Teresa. In the sacristy of the Basilica of Saint Teresa in Alba de Tormes, there is a wooden box. Inside the box are hundreds of small notes left by visitors over the centuries. Many of them are from married couples. They thank Teresa for saving their marriages. They ask her to pray for them. They promise to keep practicing the examination of cold. They admit that it is hard, but they also say that it works. One note, dated 1738, reads, "We were strangers in the same house. Now we are strangers no longer. Thank you for teaching us to tell the truth." Another, from 1891, 22 years married, 15 years cold, 3 months honest. We are just beginning. Another, from 1964, "I told him what I had been hiding. He told me what he had been hiding. We cried for 3 hours. Then we started over. The notes continue into the 21st century. The pattern never changes. The cold, the deception, the realization, the pain of truth, the slow warming, the gratitude. Teresa saw the bitter chill that settles in marriages plagued by constant deception, but she also saw the way out. And in the archives of her order, in the testimony of the couples she counseled, in the vows made in her presence and kept across decades, there is proof that warmth can return. Not easily, not quickly, but it can return. The process Teresa outlined was specific. First, exposure. Every lie had to be brought into light. She warned this could take weeks or months. In 1579, a couple in Granada followed this guidance. The husband, Alvaro, had hidden debts, gambling, and an affair. The wife, Leonor, had hidden resentment, her own emotional affair, and theft from household accounts. It took them 43 days to expose everything. Alvaro wrote to Teresa that by the end, he felt turned inside out, but clean. Second, consequence. Teresa insisted truth without consequence was hollow. Alvaro sold property to pay debts, stopped gambling, met weekly with a priest. Leonor ended contact with the neighbor, returned stolen money, cut off financial support to her brother. Both reported this stage was harder than the first because consequences were real. Third, rebuilding. Teresa said trust had to be re-earned through consistent honesty over time. If you lied for 5 years, expect 5 years proving truthfulness. Alvaro and Leonor practiced the examination of cold every night for 14 years. In 1596, Leonor wrote they had finally reached a point where the cold was gone. Teresa believed that most couples gave up during the second or third stage. They wanted instant restoration. They wanted the pain to end quickly. But she said that marriage after deception is like a bone that has been broken. It can heal, but it takes time. And if you try to use it too soon before it has fully healed, you will break it again. Worse than before. In the spring of 1581, Teresa traveled to Palencia to establish a new convent. While there, she met with a couple who had been practicing the examination of cold for 2 years. They told her that they were frustrated. They had confessed everything. They had faced the consequences. They were trying to rebuild, but they still felt distant from each other. They still felt the cold. They wanted to know when it would end. Teresa's answer was recorded by one of her companions, Sister Ana de San Bartolome, who wrote it down that same evening. Teresa told them that the cold does not end, it transforms. She said that the frost you feel now is different from the frost you felt before. Before, it was the frost of deception. Now, it is the frost of grief. You are mourning what you lost. You are mourning the years you wasted. You are mourning the innocence that is gone. That grief is painful. But it is clean pain. It is honest pain. And honest pain can heal. Deception cannot. The couple asked Teresa how long they would feel this grief. She said she did not know. She said every marriage is different. Some heal quickly, others take decades. But she promised them that if they kept practicing honesty, if they kept refusing to let new lies accumulate, the grief would eventually give way to something else. Not the passion they had felt when they first married. That was gone. But something deeper, something stronger. A love built not on fantasy, but on reality. A love that knows the worst about the other person and chooses them anyway. Teresa wrote extensively about this transformed love in her later years. She called it the love of witnesses. She said it was the love between two people who had seen each other at their worst, who had hurt each other deeply, who had every reason to walk away, but who chose to stay and do the hard work of rebuilding. She said this kind of love was rare because most people were not brave enough to pursue it. It required too much honesty, too much vulnerability, too much sustained effort. But for those who did pursue it, Teresa said, the reward was extraordinary. Because when you have been fully known and fully loved, when you have nothing left to hide and nothing left to prove, you experience a freedom that people living in deception can never understand. You are no longer performing. You are no longer managing an image. You are simply being. And being, Teresa said, is the greatest gift one person can give another. In the weeks before her death, Teresa received a final letter from Isabel, the woman whose husband had been hiding a second family. It had been 7 years since Isabel had left him and moved to Seville. In the letter, dated September 21st, 1582, Isabel told Teresa that she had recently encountered Rodrigo in the market. He was alone. He looked older. He approached her and asked if they could speak. She agreed. He told her that he had spent the past 7 years trying to make things right with the second woman, trying to be a father to all his children, trying to repair the damage he had caused. But he said it was all hollow, because he had never truly faced what he had done to Isabel. He had apologized before, but he had not really understood the depth of the wound. Now he did, and he wanted to tell her, even if it changed nothing, that he was sorry. Isabel told Teresa that she listened to Rodrigo's apology. She thanked him for it, but she did not take him back. She told him that some things, once broken, cannot be mended, not because forgiveness is impossible, but because the foundation itself was flawed from the beginning. She said she had forgiven him. She no longer carried anger, but she also would not rebuild a house on ground that had already collapsed once. Teresa never responded to that letter. She died 13 days later. But Sister Ana, who read the letter after Teresa's death, wrote in her diary that she believed Teresa would have approved of Isabel's decision. Because Teresa taught that forgiveness does not always mean reconciliation. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is to release someone from a situation that was built on lies, to set both of you free to live in truth, even if that means living apart. The legacy of Teresa's teaching on marriage continued long after her death. In 1675, a Carmelite friar named Fray José de Jesus Maria compiled testimonies from couples who had practiced the examination of cold. He published them in a small book called Remedios para el Frío Matrimonial, Remedies for Marital Coldness. The book was never widely distributed, but copies circulated in Spain and Spanish territories for the next century. In 1742, a copy was brought to the Spanish missions in California, where it was translated into several indigenous languages and used in marriage preparation programs. In 1893, a researcher named Father Silverio de Santa Teresa collected all known writings by and about Saint Teresa related to marriage, He discovered that Teresa had counseled at least 38 married couples directly between 1567 and 1582. Of those 38 marriages, 21 survived. 17 ended in separation or annulment. The survival rate of 55% might seem low, but Father Silverio noted that these were couples who had sought Teresa's help specifically because their marriages were already in crisis. They were not average marriages, they were marriages on the brink. What was remarkable, Father Silverio wrote, was that every couple who followed Teresa's three-stage process, exposure, consequence, and rebuilding, reported experiencing transformation. Even the marriages that ended reported that the process had given them clarity, freedom from bitterness, and the ability to move forward without being haunted by what might have been. They said that the examination of cold had forced them to face reality. And facing reality, even when it meant admitting the marriage was over, was better than continuing to live in a beautiful lie. In 2003, researchers examining Teresa's personal letters discovered a previously unknown manuscript tucked between pages of her spiritual journal. It was dated September 15th, 1582, 19 days before she died. In it, she describes one final vision. She saw a couple standing in a room covered in frost, but this time, one of them spoke a truth they had been hiding for years. And as the words left their mouth, a crack appeared in the ice. Then another. Then another. And within seconds, the entire frozen shell shattered and fell away. The room was warm again. The couple could see each other again. And Teresa wrote that she heard a voice say, "This is how grace works. One truth, one crack. Then everything breaks open."